Well, I want to thank Cash for inviting me and all of you for making him invite me. So I'm pleased to be here. I'm talking now as part of this class, and then I'll have a slightly different presentation a little bit later on at 6:30, I guess, where there I will talk specifically about a couple of projects that I've been working on. Here is more of a classroom lecture sort of presentation, and I have to admit it's a little intimidating coming in at the end and not knowing exactly what's been talked about before I got here. And so just bear with me in terms of what I'm presenting. I tend to have a little bit of a different viewpoint than other folks do in terms of research stuff, and my background is pretty interdisciplinary. So hopefully if there are things that you've already seen or that make sense, you get a different spin, and it's kind of interesting for that reason. And hopefully there's something new. So I will look forward to interacting with you through the presentation. Please do let me know if you have questions as we go. I'm really happy. I've got a couple of places where I will ask questions and hopefully get a little bit of feedback. But in general, if you have a comment or a question, please do let me know. So a little bit about me. I graduated from the same department as Dr. Barker at the University of Virginia. So I'm in the business school. In a department, used to be a management science department, and then it was management science and information technology, and now it's business information technology. But we basically, we've got two streams, two options for our undergraduates, which kind of subdivides our faculty. So we've got decision support systems, kind of analytics and doing computers and doing ISE kinds of things. And we have operations management, which is less on the programming side and more on the problem solving side of things. And so I tend to do research on the OM side, and I tend to teach on the decision support system side. And the research that I do tends to be the kind of stuff that we're going to talk about here. So bigger picture, how I came to what I'm going to talk about today, it was suggested to me that I talk about community resilience, which is a part of what I do. The caveat to that is I'm in the business school, I'm trained as a systems engineer, I have a background in mathematics, so undergrad and master's degree in math. But really most of the collaboration that I do at Virginia Tech is with folks from the natural sciences, from the College of Engineering, and from the College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And so I'm going to talk about social aspects of community resilience. I'm not the expert on social aspects of community resilience, but I work with a lot of experts, and so I will try not to say anything incorrect. I will certainly give you my perspective on stuff, but the caveat is I'm going to do my best to represent some things that are kind of around the edges, but that I really have dabbled in and have worked with a lot of people in some of these areas. Okay, so bear with me a little bit in terms of that. Okay, overall, I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, and so the motivation for this, being trained as a systems engineer and being in the business school, I tend to take an analytic view of things like disaster resilience, and most of my work is in what we would call disaster operations management. Okay, so applying operations management techniques, et cetera, to these disaster-related problems. In particular, the big thing that I do is I look at quantifying disaster resilience. And I know you all have been exposed to that at various levels in various different ways. I have my own perspective, which you may or may not be familiar with my perspective. I'm going to touch on it just a little bit in the context of our discussion, and a little bit more later on in the other presentation. But quantifying disaster resilience for an engineered system is a little bit different than quantifying disaster resilience for a community, because the parts are different, right? And they act in different ways, and there's different considerations you need to look at. And so really the big objective of my talk today is to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that it's really important, even when you're an engineer, to look at those social aspects. Even beyond the fact, we know you're supposed to communicate with the stakeholders, and you're supposed to, when you solve problems, that has to have the client in mind, and you need to take those considerations. I'm kind of going beyond that to, all right, well, the client, whoever is implementing the project is important, but also the people that are impacted when you do the implementation. So the stakeholders from the community standpoint are also very important. And what can we do to address the folks that are sort of indirectly impacted by this notion of resilience? And so a broader notion of an interdisciplinary approach of looking at who are all the people that are impacted when we talk about, let's look at the resilience of a community in particular, okay? And so the social dimension is an important piece of this. The disaster resilience triangle, which I think you probably have all been exposed to, is the basis for the work that I do, and so I will talk a little bit about that as we go. And then overall, this idea of integrating social science into operations management, really keeping an eye on the social aspects of these decisions and the actions that we're taking, and how that's going to manifest itself in a lot of my discussion is this notion of vulnerability. Okay? I imagine you've talked about the Social Vulnerability Index and Susan Cutter's work, and so that kind of comes into play in terms of some of the things that I'm going to talk about. The first half of my presentation is going to be specifically on quantifying disaster resilience and what folks are doing and how that sort of works and maybe doesn't quite work in the way that I look at resilience. And the second half is going to be taking a big sigh, realizing that, okay, well, we can't do yet all the things that we want to do, and so what can we do? So how can we take these issues of vulnerability and take our existence as an industrial or systems engineer and combine the two to solve some interesting and important problems, even if we can't solve all the problems that we might necessarily want to solve. Okay, so that's sort of the two halves, specifically on measurement, and then the second half, well, okay, we've gotten to a certain point. What else can we do above and beyond what we're trying to do? So the notion of disaster operations management, I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but the basic idea of managing, not managing a disaster, because you can't manage the disaster, but you can manage your response to the disaster or the activities that you undertake to mitigate against that disaster in the first place. And so a lot of the work that I do revolves around this disaster cycle or disaster operations management cycle. And it's important to mitigate, and we know that at this point it's what, $6 saved for every $1 invested in mitigation from a strictly engineering standpoint. And so mitigation is very important right up front. We need to prepare for a disaster when it's coming, whether that means bringing in the sandbags or evacuating people from the city. Response is a big part of this, obviously. Send the emergency vehicles. How can we get them there in time? How do we clear the brush from the roads? And then recovery sort of longer term with an understanding that the next thing is going to happen somewhere down the line, and so we have to start mitigating as soon as we start recovering, or perhaps even before, to make sure that we're going to be able to accomplish what we need to accomplish down the road. My research and my interests tend to lie in terms of mitigation and recovery, so more of the longer term, more strategic kinds of decisions that folks make. I've done a little bit with response, not so much, and not so much with the preparedness. So how can we leverage our analytic techniques to be able to improve the situation and operationalize some of these models that we have so that they can actually make a difference to people's lives? Obviously, it's very complicated. All right, this is my version. I know Dr. Barker has his graph with the different networks that are all interconnected, and so this is the situation that we're dealing with when we're trying to actually do something in the real world, right? So we have our physical infrastructure network, we've got our social network of the people that actually live in the community, we've got the service network that sits in between with the utility companies and the connection between the two. There's obviously multiple layers of the physical infrastructure network. There can be all sorts of disruptions that take place at a node or at a link and cascading impacts, and it's very, very complicated. And we can't get a handle on everything all at once. So a big question is, how do we measure the result of a disruption? And there's a lot of really good research going on here at Oklahoma, I know, looking into that. And so what we're going to talk about specifically is this same level of complexity in all these interconnected networks. We can look at that from the standpoint of an engineered system, but also from the standpoint of a community. Okay? And so broadly defined, a community has the physical structure, but it also has organizational structures, it also has the social structures. And so what are our options in terms of trying to measure the result of a disruption and this notion of resilience and bouncing back from that? And so, as I said, most of my work is based on this original idea of Michel Bruneau and the group at University at Buffalo and their definition of what resilience is. This ability to absorb a shock and recover quickly, but also to reduce the chances it's going to happen in the first place. Okay, it makes sense to me that if you're going to be resilient, a lot of the time folks will define resilience as that act of bouncing back, right? And it depends on who you talk to. In my mind, you're going to be able to bounce back better if you prevented all the bad stuff from happening in the first place. And if you can avoid the impact of the event to any extent, then that's also going to help you in terms of your ability to regain whatever level you're trying to get to, or maybe even to get to a better level, a level of higher functionality. Okay, so we ultimately are looking for what are techniques and approaches and investments that we can make to do that. And this notion of resilience, this notion of protecting and then bouncing back, it applies to civil infrastructure systems, but it also applies to supply chains, and it applies to communities. Well, the way that Bruno and those folks modeled, analytically characterized the notion of disaster resilience was this disaster resilience triangle. Okay, so pretty straightforward, and it's very simple. This is how I explain what I'm doing to my mother-in-law, because she can understand, all right, you're going along at a certain state, and then there's some loss, and then you can recover, and we can do some measurements of things with respect to that. And so it's a very straightforward idea. But as I think you all know, it really can be extended. You can do some nice analytic stuff, and a variety of people have taken this idea and built off of it in different directions. Okay, so we've got this notion of robustness. So this sort of skips the reduce the probability part of defining resilience and goes right to, let's assume it's going to happen. Can we measure how robust the system was, and can we measure how quickly the system was able to actually recover? This is actually really interesting to me. I've done a number of the publications that I've had have been taking this and sort of vamping on this idea of this disaster resilience triangle. And there's all sorts of interesting questions that come out of it. Like this assumes instantaneous loss, all right? And so how does it change if you've got a slow onset loss instead of instantaneous loss? Can we still keep things simple, but a lot of disasters don't occur right in one moment. They take time to sort of cascade, particularly in a supply chain context. You don't tend to see the effects for a little while. It's got to kind of propagate through the system. And so we need a little bit more general. If we're going to use this approach and make some assumptions, then we just need to make sure that we think about the different alternatives. Okay? Another thing that I've kind of looked at is this, again, sort of assumes a constant rate of recovery. Well, depending on the system, if you're putting resources in place to try to recover as quickly as possible, very often you will actually see more of an exponential recovery. All right, exponential recovery is going to give you a very different area for that disaster resilience triangle, and it might not match up with exactly the original definition of how things were. So there's just some interesting tweaks that you can apply to this when we're taking the area and to characterize what's the difference between different types of events and different types of impacts and different types of responses that we as disaster operations management folks are trying to put onto the system to improve things going forward. Okay, well, going from this notion of the loss of resilience as the area of that triangle, just really quickly, the basic idea that I took out of this was based off some work by some folks in Bruno's group a little bit later on. If you want to actually measure resilience, you want to measure the area under the curve instead of the area above the curve. Above the curve is the loss of resilience. So that means as it gets smaller, you've lost less resilience. And so to have 100% resilient be a good thing, you really want to take the area under the curve. And the way that I define it, I define this threshold T star. And so the measured resilience for this particular situation is going to be the area under the curve divided by the total area that you would have had if there was no disruption in the first place. Okay, pretty simple. It turns out that it works pretty well. This was actually, so here is a version of the equation. So we're doing 1 minus the area, basically the x bar times t. So it's 1 minus this area divided by the whole area. Okay, it's pretty simple math, not a big deal. It turns out that it does something interesting because this thing actually gives you the equation of a hyperbola. Right? And so I was on my way to some other research idea and sort of ran across this back in the day and came up with the fact that using this definition for predicted resilience, so just another kind of resilience, you can come up with these predicted resilience curves where if you think about what we've got when we're looking at the disaster resilience triangle, you can have various shaped triangles there that'll give you exactly the same area under the curve. Right? Very little loss and a huge long recovery time. It's going to give you the same area as a lot of loss and a very short recovery time. And so there's trade-offs between loss and recovery time. Those trade-offs come into play if you use this very simple formulation, and if you actually plot the hyperbolas that it represents, you get these predicted resilience curves. And again, there's some things we can do with this for visualizing what the trade-offs are. But now I can plot on here an instance of a loss curve where I've got the average loss over the period of time, and I've got how long it took it to recover. And so I can plot it on here. In fact, I can go through and I can plot 100 different systems in my simulated results that I've got. Things that end up down here, though, are going to be higher on the amount of loss and lower on the recovery time. Well, that's a very different kind of behavior than things where you've got a very long recovery time but very little loss, which is going to be characterized by observations that show up on this part of the curve, or that part of the set of curves, where each one of these lines represents a single constant value for resilience, and you get higher and higher resilience as you get closer to the origin there. Okay, that's the top-down view. This is the three-dimensional view where I threw in the z-axis is the measurement of resilience. We can also do some things with this. We can make some assumptions about priorities and preferences for the different folks that are trying to analyze the resilience of all these different systems. We can actually do some adjustments based on the efficiency of the recovery process as you're trying to get back up and get back to your 100% level of functionality. It's a simple thing, and it does a nice job, I think, of allowing you to really understand better what these trade-offs are between the loss and the recovery time. Because particularly in a supply chain context, if you're investing a lot of money, or in really any context where we've got these huge systems, it might be a very, very different kind of investment to prevent the loss in the first place. All right? So mitigation type investments tend to be very, very different than pre-positioning your resources so you can respond very quickly and have that recovery take place. This can help you know if you've got a situation where it's much more likely you're going to have initial loss and persistent loss, or is it much more likely that we're going to have to invest our resources to address things and recover more quickly. Okay, so this is my notion of resilience. This is how I think of resilience. It's pretty simple, but it actually gives you some power to do some trade-offs, and because we can plot multiple observations at the same time, we really can do a nice comparison of different systems and different parts of systems and understand how they vary with respect to their ability to resist and then recover the different events that we might be dealing with. So this is for a single event and a single measurement, so a single index of performance for that single event gives us this complexity. Well, you go back to the original Bruneau paper, and they talk about the multidimensionality of disaster resilience. Right? So the technical and the organizational and the social and the economic dimensions of disaster resilience. That with my engineering hat on, I tend to think of the bridge, and I'm going to measure the functionality of the bridge. And all right, so it got damaged, and so it drops down to one lane. And then it takes us some time to recover, and eventually it comes back up to 100%. It's a single bridge and a single dimension, really just the physical dimension. But that bridge being down also has an impact on people's ability to get to work, right? It's going to slow them down. You got lost productivity, so there's economic impacts. There's social impacts potentially if people were directly physically impacted by the fact that that bridge failed, and organizational impacts in terms of the ability of the organization to implement the recovery process, implement the immediate response to it to be able to save people's lives and to address the situation and the impact that had occurred when that thing had its collapse. Okay, so there's different, and they recognize right from the beginning that there's different ways of looking at an event and characterizing that resilience, and they're in pretty different categories with respect to what they're trying to measure or what they're trying to indicate in terms of that behavior of the system. So let's look at community resilience and just spin it just a little bit to the side. So if we think about a community and we think about using this pretty well established at this point way of building a time series where we can measure functionality, and then there's some loss, and then we've got some recovery, and we measure the percent of the system which was lost and how long it occurred, et cetera. can we apply this to community resilience as a separate entity, as a separate idea? Okay, and so just thinking about a community, well, community is made up of the buildings and the infrastructure. So we've got the engineering side of things. Community is made up of social groups and individuals, and so we've got the sociology side of things, the social science side of things. We can talk about business resilience on the economic side of things. We can talk about environmental resilience, which we don't really talk about enough, that a real-world system is embedded in the environment, and so what's the impact on that environment and the impact of the environment on the system? I'll come back to that in a little bit. And so as we sort of divide things up this way, there's a lot of expertise out there in each of these areas, right? There's a lot of great engineers, many of whom are right here, who are looking at resilience for things that are in a community and doing a great job of modeling it very carefully and very completely, but tending to be focused maybe more on the engineering side of things than other groups might be. I know some really, really good social scientists, a lot of geographers and urban planners that are characterizing resilience from a social standpoint. On the economic side, a lot of people are doing supply chain resilience and looking at issues there. So we've got expertise in all these different silos. In my mind, there's not enough blend and integration and overlap between them. Okay? I think there's advantages, even if we're trained as engineers, and that's really our strength, and that's the main highway that we're going down, to be able to incorporate in the perspective of someone who's a social scientist, the perspective of someone who's from the business school, to really inform around the edges the alternatives that you present, your way of convincing the client that, all right, you really need to think about this, and here's another aspect of it that you need to take into account before you make your investment. Really important, in my mind, to try to get as holistic as possible to really understand the interconnections between these things and to integrate some of the ideas that are here. Okay, and community resilience is a good place to do this because all the moving parts, as I said, really are very diverse, come from a variety of different directions. But we basically have a system of systems, system of interconnected systems, where it's pretty rare to find someone, maybe even impossible to find someone who really is integrated across all of those dimensions. We tend to be really good in one, and then we've got some experience in some of the others, and we can tie things together. But I think it's really important to have the communication and for us to really be thinking holistically as we approach problems like this. Like, how do we get a handle on this notion of community resilience? Okay, so the first question, and this is more of a rhetorical question than an actual question, but if this is how I define resilience, and this is how I define resilience, is this going to work for measuring community resilience? Okay, maybe. Maybe not. Why might it not work for measuring community resilience? All right, we just talked about community. You got the engineering, you got the social, you got the business, you've got the et cetera. Okay, but the thing I said previous to that is that this really just represents one particular process, right? So I've kind of picked a bridge, and I've said this bridge is at 100%, and then we have some loss, and then we have some recovery from that. Well, I can measure that, and that's part of a community, so I can certainly measure that aspect of a community. All right, and I would say you can kind of pick and choose. You go to a community, you go to Blacksburg, Virginia, where Virginia Tech is, and I can analyze that community and the resilience of the roadways, the resilience of the university. There have been some things in the past we've had to deal with and recover from as a university, and we can measure those things. And this is what I'm used to doing, but might it not always work, is really the question. Okay? And the answer is, right, it might not always work. And so what I want to dig into is, okay, well, why not? Why can't we just use this to kind of get a handle on this situation where we maybe have a bunch of curves where we're looking at the resilience for all of those together? That's a way of approaching it. It's maybe not as clean as combining everything into a single indicator, but it seems like we should be able to get a handle on what's going on. Okay, so our different components. Engineering, we probably, in fact, we know for certain we can use that disaster resilience triangle and measure stuff that way. All right, it's been done. There's a lot of good research that's still being built on. Economics, same thing. Adam Rose from the University of Southern California is doing a lot of work. He was part of the original group at the University of Buffalo, is doing economic resilience and using the disaster resilience triangle and different versions of that. In the natural sciences, it kind of makes sense. You can look at some sort of a natural process and look at loss and look at recovery. So say we're looking at marshes along the New Jersey coast after Hurricane Sandy. They were pretty devastated with the high waves and everything, but you could measure the extent to which species had to move out, or the vegetation got washed away, and then how long does it take for it to reconstitute. So we can still have this notion of the loss and then the recovery time. Where it gets tricky is when you get to just purely that social part, okay, which is just part of community resilience. So community resilience is the whole thing, but the social aspects are an important piece of this. If we want to characterize resilience of a community, we can't leave that out, right? You got to include the human side of things. But that's where it starts getting a little tricky, because things don't necessarily work the same way, right? And so the issue is how can I measure the functionality of a purely human system, all right? So aspects of the environment within which those humans exist, we can measure this way. But how about a purely human system? Can I do this same thing? Is really the driving question here. Okay, so what makes a human system resilient? We could keep going, right? I mean, there's all these aspects, and income is a big one. We'll talk about that in a second. This notion of unity, the notion of communication. What starts making it tricky is how do you measure unity? All right, so we're talking about characterizing resilience. It's maybe a little bit different than measuring or quantifying the resilience. And when we start getting into things like unity and communication and all these different aspects of what it actually means, this ability to recover and be adaptable, how do you measure the ability to be adaptable? I want to know how to do that, because then I can do this. Then I can apply my tool, right? The problem is it's not easy, or it might be possible, but it's really tricky to do that. It's a very different kind of beast than measuring the functionality in a bridge, right? What's the functionality in a human system? And so that's kind of the first challenge. And it's still sort of an outstanding challenge that's out there, and there's some work being done on trying to get a handle on that, right? How can we characterize unity? How can we measure that so that we know that one community has more unity than another, and so that we could do some sort of a test to show or to prove statistically that, yes, that actually did help. That made them more resilient. We think that it does. All right, it seems like it would, but can we prove it? Right? What can we do to do that? Okay, so characteristics of a resilient human system are exactly like y'all said. And then the next step, and we're not really going to get to that, but this is where I start getting really interested. All right, now what can we do to actually make them more resilient? How do I make them more unified? All right, and again, social sciences, there are theories in place where they've looked at some of these things. How can we increase the extent to which people communicate? There's a lot of research being done on that. And from an operations management standpoint, from being in the business school and saying we want to make investments, we want to improve the situation, I want to help people out and save their lives and improve their lives, I want to go that next step. But to get to that next step, we have to be able to do the first step of actually analytically characterizing what does it mean to be resilient. Okay, well, it's a problem that's been out there for a while, and it's a problem that a lot of people have really dug into trying to understand. So here are some examples of different frameworks for measuring community resilience. All right, we're not going to go through in a lot of detail each of them. We'll talk specifically about the People's Framework. It's a pretty nice one, and it meshes pretty well with an engineering sort of view of the world. But some really, really smart people are working on this stuff. Susan Cutter is at the University of South Carolina, and her group there came up with this baseline resilience indicators for communities, this BRIC tool. She's done a lot of work on social vulnerability, and she's the social vulnerability index, and we'll revisit that in a little bit. So they've come up with their framework for measuring community resilience. Walt Peacock at Texas A&M, his group has come up with a different one. All right, so the Community Disaster Resilience Indicator Framework. NIST, Dr. Nicholson here is part of this effort for NIST for coming up with a community resilience framework. It's out of Colorado State. They've got various people all over the country kind of working with them on coming up with a way of measuring community resilience, actually quantifying community resilience. People's framework we'll talk about in just a second. That's at the University of Buffalo, came out of Bruneau's work. And it's a pretty nice way of doing things. And then Scott Miles and Stephanie Chang, they were both at University of Washington together. And then Scott was at Western Washington, and he's now a private consultant and having a lot more fun. They came up with this resilient United States model. Okay? These are all pretty much, at least to a certain extent, based on this notion of addressing vulnerabilities. All right? And so we can kind of go back and reverse the question that I asked before. If you ask, well, what is it that makes a community resilient? Asking what makes it not resilient gets to that notion of vulnerability, right? If you don't have unity, you're going to be more vulnerable. Right? If you don't have the funds, you're going to be more vulnerable. If you don't communicate, et cetera. And so there's been a lot of research done on vulnerability, and particularly in geography and in the social sciences. And Susan Cutter is really a world leader in that. And so this notion of measuring community resilience really is based very heavily on that notion of how do we measure the vulnerability of the population so that we can tell when they have managed to overcome those vulnerabilities with respect to a disaster event of some sort. Okay, so the People's Framework, as an example of this, the People's is just the first letter of each of these different categories. And it's the same sort of thing as the technological and organizational and social and economic for the different dimensions of disaster resilience when you're looking at the resilience triangle. These are, in a sense, the different dimensions for community resilience, right, that they've come up with in this framework. And this is really characteristic of what the BRIC framework looks like and what my understanding of what the NIST framework looks like. This is pretty typical. And so what they try to do is they try to get a handle on this complexity of, okay, it's unity and it's communication, and there's all these different aspects. It's the income and the financial ability to do stuff. And so they break it down into demographics about who the population is and what are their characteristics. What's the environment within which they live? What are the government services that are helping them thrive within that environment? What are the physical infrastructures in terms of buildings and lifelines, et cetera? Lifestyle and community competence. What's the quality of life? How many people are involved in volunteering for organizations and part of local government? Economic development. How strong is the economy of that given community? And then the social cultural capital is things like how many people go to church and how strong is their faith-based group and how good connections do they have to one another to get at this issue of unity. And they've done a lot of work at really trying to be pretty complete at what these different dimensions are of a community being resilient. Okay, and what's interesting, and you all might have seen this certainly in other contexts, but what it turns out is the way that you measure this stuff is you use different indicators, like median income, exactly. And so for us to characterize the population, and it could go in population or it could go down in the economic. I think the economic is more focused at the large-scale community level. This is more at the individual level. We can measure things like median income, and if you get a higher median income, you're likely to be more resilient as a community. Age distribution. All right, I can think of several ways that you could measure that. It's not real clean though, right? If you think about it, if you have very young folks or very elderly folks, they're going to be less resilient themselves individually, which means the rest of the community also will be because they have to help the young and the elderly in order to evacuate them, in order to make sure they have food and water. And so it's a pretty good indication what percentage of your population is in which of these bins. Environmental ecosystem, water quality is a big thing that we can measure to kind of characterize the environment within which this community is surviving. Biomass, we can actually measure that, and they do with satellite imagery. So you can compare how much greenery is there in a given location before and after the big storm. That gives you an indication of how stable the environmental side of things is. And then we can kind of go through this, and we won't go into a lot of detail on any of these, but just to give you an idea, this is a subset of the indicators that are defined within this framework. Okay, there are probably 10 to 20 to 30 actually in each of these different categories that are intending to try to get a handle on what does it mean to have a resilient community in terms of this demographics dimension. What are all the characteristics that are going to make it more resilient? Okay, facilities and lifelines, how many ambulances do we have? How long are people waiting in the emergency department at the hospital? Some of them seem pretty esoteric. They've done a lot of work to make sure that they really are pretty good indicators of when it goes up or down. It tells you if you're more or less resilient. But this is pretty descriptive or representative of what these frameworks tend to look like. Okay, quality of life, percent of citizens involved in politics, number of banks and credit unions, number of community centers and non-for-profit organizations. So they're all things that we can measure. All right, in looking at this list though, what's the problem? It still doesn't quite fit into what I want to do with my disaster resilience triangle. Why not? Okay, each of these things is measurable. All right, I can come up with a measure for the number of community centers. And in fact, I can look at that before the hurricane and after the hurricane, right? So we had 5 functional community centers, and then we lost 2 of them because there was flooding. And so we actually had some sort of a loss and then recovery. And that I can look at how that has changed, because a community with 3 is maybe not as resilient as a community with 5. Okay, so I can do some of that, but the problem is we also have things like quality of life. Right? How the heck do you measure quality of life? And it turns out the way that they do it for this framework is they survey people. All right, that's great, and they're going to get great data, but it's not really practical to do that too often, right? If we want to be able to measure resilience before the event, resilience during the event, resilience or what the capacity is and how things are responding, you can't go back and interview people and interview people and interview people. They're just going to give up. So how do you actually get access to that data? And as you start looking at these different measures, you run into that issue a lot. Okay, so these are all important things to measure, but they don't quite fit into our framework of I want a time series where I can measure it over time and get access to how it's dropping and how it's recovering, so that I can measure that area under the curve and then combine all those different areas to get a good idea of what's going on. Okay, and so in terms of analytically measuring stuff, it's really hard to get a handle on all the different pieces of this framework, okay, and incorporate it into the model. And part of the problem, it's meaningful data. They're indicators that give us this notion of, all right, how unified is the community, and I think we all agree that's an important piece of it, all right, but it's not necessarily measurable. All right, it may be measurable in some contexts, but not in all contexts. Right? We can't always get access to the data. And so sort of the upshot of all of this is that in many cases, and this is something that people are working on, in many cases a resilience framework like this people's framework, it's not really intended to, and the authors understand that it really doesn't serve the purpose of giving us this time series curve and measuring stuff over time as it changes. It really is much more about measuring the capacity for resilience before the fact. All right? A lot of Susan Cutter's work, in particular with that brick model, they've gone through, and there's a couple of really nice published papers out there where they calculated the community resilience value for all the major cities in the southeastern United States. It's a great tool for understanding which cities are more likely to have a problem if a hurricane hits them or some major natural disaster hits them. And they can spend the time to go through and calculate all these indicator values and combine everything and come up with the final result that they want to come up with, and then compare different cities based on this. But it's really much more of a static measure. All right, we can measure this stuff in advance. It doesn't lend itself to this dynamic way of I've got an actual natural hazard that's occurring that's impacting the community, and I want to see what's going on and try to understand how things are changing. Okay, and it's kind of an outstanding problem. No one really has yet come up with a great solution to that, because we have to do this complexity of measuring stuff, but it doesn't lend itself as nearly as easily as a lot of other things to this notion of a dynamic sense of resilience as opposed to a static sense of the capacity for resilience. Okay, this is a huge problem also in supply chain. So I'm trained as an engineer. I still kind of think like an engineer, but I'm in the business school. So my dean wants me to study supply chain resilience rather than critical infrastructure resilience exclusively. A lot of the work that's been done in supply chain resilience is more on the lines of capacity for resilience. We're going to measure it to characterize what might happen in the future should something possibly happen. We'll know that this organization is better than that one because these characteristics make it better than these characteristics. There's more and more work going on this, and I know people are working on extensions to the People's Framework and trying to get a handle on this. But I've talked with Susan Cutter about this. I kind of complained to her that, wait a minute, resilience has to do with responding to a particular disaster event. All right, and if you think about that curve is in response to a particular event occurring. And I was unhappy with the fact that her indicators just don't work in that case. Part of the reason why is that a lot of the values that they get are drawn off of US Census data. Right, US Census data only comes out every 10 years. There's no way you can update some of these values even when you've got some event and you want to track how things are happening. And she said, we understand that, and what we want to be able to leverage this to come up with ways to measure the dynamic nature of resilience rather than just this capacity for resilience. Okay, and so folks are working on this. The main way that I've seen that people are kind of being able to take this community resilience notion from these frameworks and to actually build it into a measurement type model tend to have to do with simulation rather than looking at actual empirical data. Okay, so the folks, Rentschler and the folks that have published the most on the People's Framework, they have some really nice simulation models of critical infrastructures, and they use agent-based modeling to represent the characteristics of the humans. And so you get the social aspect, and you can look at how things change as people react in different ways. And so that's certainly a way of approaching this, and really important, and it gives us an amazing amount of information to be able to make good decisions and to incorporate that human component of things. I also, however, really want to be able to look at stuff empirically. So look at an actual disaster, Hurricane Sandy. How can I characterize how the resilience of the community changed during and after Hurricane Sandy? Well, I can simulate it. And that's great, but I'd also really like to be able to do the other. I'd like to be able to get empirical data and actually look and see how the changes were for validation purposes and to have a better understanding of what all these moving parts are. Okay, and so social indicator variables, they do a great job. They give us this complexity, but they really don't give us the dynamic or adaptive resilience. We can simulate changes in them and get an idea as long as we do a lot of work to really validate that it's representing what would actually happen. And a big part of the problem is that the data is collected very much on larger time scales than we want. Okay? And again, on the supply chain resilience side of things, you can look at economic resilience of firms, but they're only generating results every quarter. So you get one number every 3 months. Well, okay, I can see a little bit of dip and then recovery, but it's not as good as being able to have daily data or hourly data and being able to kind of understand the details of how things are changing. Okay? Even with all of that, we still have this multidimensionality problem, right? So I can do one curve for each of these indicators. How do I understand what all of them together are indicating, what they really mean when I combine them to be able to characterize what resilience is doing? Okay? And there's good work with using heat maps and so trying to use different colors and using topographies to understand the complexity of what's going on. But there's still some work to be done. There's lots of opportunity to kind of dig into this. We're not going to be able to use all of these indicators to characterize how stuff changes over time because the data is just not there. But can we find equivalent or good enough indicators where maybe there is the ability to do that so that we can have real-world data and simulated data and really do a nice job of understanding better what's going on and improving our models and being able to really make a difference. Okay, and so the upshot of this first discussion is we need to do more research. There's opportunity. The frameworks are there, and they're great for what they do. They don't quite fit into my worldview of what's needed. One of the things I've been working on that I'll talk about more in my second presentation later on is social media data. Can we use social media data as a sort of minute-by-minute indicator of what's going on with the community that maybe gives us a better, sort of more on-the-ground picture of what's happening? Obviously, we would love to have fully censored bridges and roadways and buildings so that anytime anything happens, we can see exactly where it got impacted and how quickly it took it for it to recover and so forth and so on. And so the Internet of Things is a pretty exciting concept in terms of giving us the ability to really measure stuff at a much finer level of detail and to be able to get at this notion of how things are changing over time. Okay, and so there's opportunity to do stuff. It's not clear exactly what direction to go in, but I think there's lots of different things that we could do to jointly model these more static indicators and the more dynamic variables which change over time, and to be able to understand this complexity of the community resilience as a whole. Okay, that being said, all is not lost, all right, because the community resilience frameworks are very, very useful. All right, they're maybe not useful for exactly how I would want to use them for, which is tracking how stuff happens over time, but in terms of helping a community understand what it's doing well and what it needs to be doing in order to get better, that notion of capacity for resilience is really, really important on a couple of different levels. Okay, it allows for benchmarking. If you can show that your community is less resilient than some other community and you can identify the differences, then you can make investments to bring yourself up to that level, whatever that is. It provides a platform for sharing knowledge. We talked about communication. This is actually one of the most important parts of these resilience frameworks, is that someone's got to sit down and gather all this data and decide what's important and decide what those values are and decide how the community fits into this and what the community feels is most important. And it gives a venue within which a community can have a discussion about that. It encourages them to actually think about the fact that there might be another tornado or there might be an earthquake in the future. Right? That in and of itself is maybe one of the most important things, to get people thinking about the fact that just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's never going to happen. Okay? Really hard to convince human beings to look into the future and assume that or understand that something bad could potentially happen in the future just based on the way things work. Okay? Encourages thinking about interactions with the environment, helps with better understanding and preparedness, identifying vulnerabilities, etc. So there's lots of really good aspects that are very important from a community building standpoint of being able to characterize all these indicators of these 7 different dimensions or however many dimensions the model that you're using comes up with, to be able to better understand what's going on. Okay, so part 2. Then. So that's my sort of depressing end of part 1, that here we've got these tools that are out there and they don't do quite what I want them to do. But I still want to be able to have an impact on those communities and help those communities improve. A lot of the research that I do is on humanitarian operations, so helping the Red Cross recover from a disaster. How can they be more efficient and use their funds wisely to be able to serve more people? And so from an operations management standpoint, that tends to be my skewed view, is I want to impact the vulnerability of the population. If it's not in terms of measuring resilience as a grand plan, what are some of the other things that we can do? Okay, and so to sort of transition into that, we talked about the fact that different components of a community, we've got the engineering and the economics and the natural sciences and sociology. We talked about social vulnerability, and we talked about the importance of strengthening that social component and how that's going to help the community do better when an actual disaster comes along. Okay, and if we think of technological and organizational and social and economic, why is the social so important? Okay, so that's what the why does it matter question is getting at. So you've got to fix the bridges, right? You need to make sure that the economy keeps going. Why is it that out of all of that, this notion of social vulnerability is so important? Okay, just underlying why is it that the human component is so important, when it's much easier to go and fix the bridge than to worry about the complexity of all of those indicators. Why do we need to worry about the complexity of the social side of things? Okay, this is one of those Socratic questions where the answer is probably really obvious, but for one, we should do it just because we should, right? Because we're human beings and we should be helping other human beings. But I think you can even make a stronger case for it than that. Okay? And in my mind, because I don't know if I could pose the question in the way that I probably should be able to pose the question, what it comes down to is there's a big difference between a natural hazard and a disaster, right? I mean, they're related, but the natural hazard is the hurricane or the earthquake. Well, a natural hazard is only a disaster if it impacts human beings. Right? If you've got a hurricane and it wipes out an island and there's no humans there, then it's not a disaster. I mean, it is maybe from an environmental standpoint, but our definition of a disaster tends to be some sort of a disruptive event that causes enough damage that the community that's impacted cannot recover on their own. They need to bring in outside resources in order to be able to recover. Well, that assumes that there was a community there and that it's actually the destruction or the impact on the community that's the important thing. Well, if there's no people there, there's no community. And so ultimately, it really is about the people. I mean, we can have all these grand visions of saving the world, but it really does boil down to, when I talk about a bridge, the importance of fixing the bridge is so that people can get to work and so that they're not in a dangerous situation as they're trying to do that. Okay, and so just to kind of loop around, that's sort of the bottom line, is it really does come back. It comes down to the social aspect. That's our motivation for doing this, and it really is the bottom line for why it matters to think about these issues and to include the social aspect in our perception and our discussion of what's going on. Okay, and so this is actually my favorite question to ask about resilience. All right, and this is what I take to my social science friends or whoever, just to say, all right, well, this is what I think is really important to ask, to really keep our minds in this broader space. If you talk about something being resilient, I really don't believe you can do that without talking about what it's being resilient to. Okay, because you can be resilient to a hurricane, and that's very, very different than being resilient to an earthquake, right? Totally different thing. So the thing you're being resilient to, particularly if you think about a structure, I could build a building that's going to really be able to withstand a pretty strong earthquake, but maybe it's susceptible to flooding. All right? And so that building was resilient, but only to an earthquake, not to this other sort of event. So you got to ask, what are you being resilient to? And when we're measuring the loss, well, that loss is as a result of some particular kind of event. Okay, so what's being resilient? What's it being resilient to? In what way is it being resilient? So I can exhibit different kinds of resilience as a human being or as a bridge or as some sort of a critical infrastructure. And then this is also really important. Okay, for whom is it being resilient? Okay, so who's the stakeholder? Who's the client? Who ultimately is it that's being impacted? And it's one of those sort of obvious things, but we had, a couple of weeks ago, we had Gavin Smith come and visit us. He's the director of the Coastal Resilience Center at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's a geographer, so much more of a social scientist than I am, and he really digs into this notion of community resilience, et cetera. And we were talking about the fact that one of my colleagues in the civil engineering department at Virginia Tech is really well known for studying seawalls. And there's this famous example of the seawall along the coast of New Jersey that had been buried in the sand, and they forgot it was there. But that section of the coastline was completely protected during Hurricane Sandy. All the houses that were along the beach didn't get impacted much more than just getting a little bit wet. Other sections of the beach where they didn't have that seawall, even though they didn't know it was there, it did a good job. Other sections completely wiped out the homes that were there. All right, and so I think it was published in Science. She actually wrote about this and how they had found it and how they analyzed what the impacts were. And I think that's a great example of resilience and engineering, and seawalls are going to protect the community, make that community more resilient. And Gavin Smith said, I really hate that because that's not resilient at all, because it completely, the storm, it basically washed away all the vegetation, and the natural environment is not in its natural state because you built the seawall. So the seawall completely disrupted the natural environment, and that's not resilient at all because you changed it, and the natural environment can never go back to what it was. Okay, so the seawall makes that community resilient for the humans. It doesn't make it resilient for the environment. Okay, you can have an investment that makes a building resilient from the standpoint of the insurance company because it didn't get destroyed, but it's not resilient from the standpoint of the people whose stuff inside was completely destroyed. So they lost all of their knowledge and all their proprietary information. It can be resilient in different ways for different people. And I think that's a really important piece of this whole picture of what resilience means and the importance of it. And so I always try, and I'm not always successful, but I always try to ask all the different parts of this when I'm thinking about how resilient is this really, and that environment versus community. I tend to fall on the side of, well, it saved the community, that's a good thing, and he was having none of that. He was not impressed with the fact that that community had destroyed the natural environment in order for it to end up being saved. Okay, so in order to integrate across disciplines, we need to think about these things. We want to be able to extend our engineering-based approaches and really incorporate the social dimension. And I just want to do one more example. I know I got about 10 more minutes maybe here. You all might have seen this. This is a nice example to me of taking an engineering viewpoint and extending it just a little bit to incorporate more of a social sort of understanding and incorporating some of those issues that we deal with when we're on the social side of a community. Okay, risk. This is basically the definition that I learned in college and in grad school. Very simple. There's lots of different ways of defining defining risk, right? But this is sort of the standard. You got the probability and then the impact, and that gives you the amount of risk that's associated with it. Okay, well, from the social science, the geography side of things, this is a much more common definition. Okay, this notion of hazard times exposure times vulnerability. And so it's the probability aspect comes in the hazard likelihood, and then the exposure is the extent to which physical aspects of the community or individuals within the community are actually exposed to it. And then vulnerability gets at things like what's the average income and to what extent, if someone is impacted, are they going to suffer as a result? Okay, I really like this definition a lot of risk because it does bring in the social aspects of things. It's not just how likely is it you're going to have the tornado and what buildings are going to be hit, but to what extent are the people or the owners or folks that are associated with that, to what extent are they actually going to be impacted? Okay, and so it's a very easy way, natural way of incorporating that perspective and coming up with very similar results in terms of trying to understand this notion of risk. Okay, so the hazard likelihood is the probability of occurrence. There's different types of hazards that might occur, and so the probability of a hurricane occurring at a particular time of a particular strength in a particular location is one thing, but what's the probability of flooding, what's the probability of a storm, et cetera. You've got different hazard likelihoods that you might need to characterize if you're trying to look at the risk for a particular location. Exposure is the one to me that's really pretty interesting, and in thinking a lot about the notion of resilience, it occurred to me a while ago that if you had a company that had some sort of infrastructure, some sort of physical infrastructure associated with it, if your store is located in Topeka, Kansas, it's very likely it's going to be 100% resilient to the next hurricane that hits Florida. Right? So that store is going to be able to recover really, really easily because that store wasn't impacted at all by that hurricane. The hurricane showed up. The hurricane hit a lot of things, but that particular store wasn't exposed at all. And so the risk is zero to that store of being hit by a hurricane. Even the store that is in Palm Beach, if the hurricane doesn't happen to go there, the exposure is zero, and so the actual realized risk ends up being zero because even if it would have been very vulnerable, if the hurricane didn't hit it, then it didn't actually actualize any of that risk. Okay, so storm might not happen, the storm might not hit. We can think of exposure in terms of buildings or people or different systems, natural systems, how many assets are actually in the path of the hurricane, what's the likelihood that it'll hit if we are actually in a place where it is likely to do that. And then vulnerability goes back to our discussion about those different indicators for community resilience. Same sort of thing, again, kind of flipped on its head. Vulnerability tends to be an inherent characteristic of the affected building or asset or the person in the population. And we had this discussion, basically, that people that are old or sick or very young people or people without transportation are going to be more vulnerable to a large event. If they happen to be exposed and if the event happens to happen, then the risk that is realized is likely to be much higher than folks that are less vulnerable. Okay? And so this is not the greatest example, and I'm still sort of working out in my head the difference between exposure and vulnerability. So if I build a house on stilts on the coast, I'm going to reduce its vulnerability to flooding, but I'm probably going to increase its vulnerability to the strong winds. And then my question is that actually vulnerability or is that exposure? Because I'm now no longer exposing it to the flooding, but I'm exposing it to the wind. And so depending on how you look at this stuff, it does sort of blend together. But vulnerability tends to be thought of from the human perspective. If people are in a more vulnerable state, then they're more likely to, they're going to have more risk. They're going to be impacted to a greater extent if that actually gets actualized. Okay, and then the social vulnerability index, and Dr. Barker said you all had talked about this. This is how typically you would measure vulnerability. All right? And they do the same sorts of things as in the frameworks that we looked at. So go through and use age and income and ethnicity and vehicles and et cetera. One thing which is kind of interesting, and I'm going to talk about this in the later presentation, they explicitly say that they weight all of those indicators equally because they don't really have a reason not to. They can't justify not weighting them equally. Okay, but I would say the number of elderly or sick people is probably more important than the average income, for example. I mean, I don't know for that particular example, but I would think there would be big differences. And it seems like someone should at least try to figure out what those differences might be. And then do a sensitivity analysis to say, all right, well, this is our range as a community. This is what we believe. These are our preferences for what we would like to focus our resources on. I think that's a pretty important thing. Okay, but the SOVI is available by city and by US county for all across the United States. All right, this is something that we used in a work that I did with the Red Cross. And it's also, they're developing equivalent sets of indicators for other countries. So these are the 4 that I know about now. There's different data available from their census departments, and there's different cultural preferences for things, and so they actually measure slightly differently, but it's the same sort of idea. There's all these indicators, and then you basically equally weight them and come up with a single overall normalized value that gives you an indication of what the vulnerability is for that particular location that we can then combine with the exposure and the hazard probability to have our notion of risk. Okay, and so my takeaway from this, as an engineer, as someone who does disaster operations management, what can I do with this? All right, well, I can't change the hazard likelihood. All right? I'm not going to change the probability that a hurricane is going to occur. Some things maybe, all right, if I'm looking at responding to terrorism or something, maybe I can do things to mitigate and to change the likelihood that that could happen. But for natural disasters, I'm not going to have an impact on the hazard likelihood. I'm really not going to have an impact on vulnerability in the short term. I can't change the number of elderly people that are currently living in that village when the hurricane's about to show up. I just don't have control over that. But I can change exposure. All right? And so what I can leverage as someone who has money to invest and wants to make a difference, I can evacuate the population so that if no one's there, no one's being exposed. I've reduced the overall risk to that event. I can provide generators and food and blankets and cots, a little bit different change in exposure, but even if people are actually being impacted, if they've got access to electricity and food and blankets, the strength of that impact is going to be much less because we've provided them with protection. I can move physical assets. Very often they will, like the military, will move all of their aircraft if there's large storm warnings in a particular place in the United States. They'll move their aircraft somewhere else, and it's sort of like evacuating the population. And so I have the ability to leverage changes on that particular dimension. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to say is this is a little bit unsatisfying to say that I can't change vulnerability, right? That all I can change is exposure. And so there are opportunities to change vulnerability, but they might not be in the short term. And so this is really my love in terms of application of this disaster operations management stuff. How can I help with humanitarian relief or humanitarian development aid, sort of longer term, helping people build those capacities to have those communities be stronger and to increase their capacity in these different dimensions that we looked at. Development aid is typically a longer term sort of deal where you look at after the immediate response phase. We're into the recovery phase and the mitigation phase. What can we do to teach people how to better respond the next time around? And then disaster relief, there's lots of interesting problems for how can we go in and provide help to folks. I don't have time to go through. I had another little extra discussion about equity, because equity is one of these interesting concepts. There are different kinds of equity, and you can actually address vulnerability by focusing on the people that have the greatest amount of need first. Very often when people talk about equity, they talk about it from the standpoint of you need to be fair to everybody. You got to provide the same amount of aid to everybody. But there's something to be said for giving the most aid to the people that need it first, as long as everyone else is still going to be okay, and then kind of going down, scaling down in terms of providing the resources we need to provide. And so that's a sort of a shorter term way in which we can leverage this social understanding and this notion of addressing vulnerability and building up the resilience of the folks that are in the community. Okay, and so summary of what I talked about, and I know I did a lot of hand waving, but that's what I tend to do when I talk. So measuring community resilience, we took a high level view of sort of what the options are, what's in place, and what at least is there for us to work with, okay, and the advantages that that currently has, and the advantages that I hope we can sort of dig out of that for future research. Resilience triangle is pretty important. The social component is very different than the other dimensions, but I do think that it is important to look and to think about how the community is changing over time on the social side of things as well. Okay, and then I think there are lots of interesting opportunities in general to integrate our problem solving across different disciplines, but in particular to bring this notion of vulnerability into play and to integrate from the social sciences into the natural sciences and engineering, so that when we take a problem-focused approach to things, we're really making sure that we expand, and we do a lot of the time, right? But it's always good to sort of keep that as an additional objective because I think there are lots of opportunities to make a difference in that.